let's explore what multimodality is all about. Essentially, it names the entire field where semiotic work happens. It's a domain for inquiry, meaning it helps us understand how different resources and spaces come together to create meaning. Now, the key idea here is that language is just one of many resources we use for making meaning. It's not the only player in the game. In multimodal discourse analysis, or MMDA, we challenge the traditional idea that language has priority over other modes. Instead, we see all modes, whether visual, gestural, or textual, as partial means, each capable of being the main mode depending on the context. So in some environments, a visual image might take center stage, while in others, speech or writing might be more prominent. All these modes, spoken language, writing, images, gestures, must be viewed as part of a cohesive, interconnected field of resources. They work together to help us make meaning in a culture. In MMDA, we treat speech and writing as distinct modes because they have entirely different material properties and social functions. Because of this, the term language as a single, unified concept is actually set aside in favor of discussing these different modes separately. So overall, multimodality is about recognizing the rich, complex array of resources we use to construct meaning, and understanding that no single mode holds priority over others. Each has its own role depending on the situation. The aim of MMDA, or multimodal discourse analysis, is to develop tools that help us understand how a community's meanings are reflected and shaped through its semiotic manifestations. Essentially, we want to explore how different modes, like language, images, gestures, work together to create meaning. A key question we often ask in MMDA is about the appropriate use of these modes for realizing discourses within a specific social situation. In other words, how do the modes we choose and combine help us communicate effectively in particular contexts? It's important to remember that the meaning of a text is not just what the creator intended, but also what is jointly produced by all the modes used in that text. So, the overall meaning resides in the collective contribution of every mode involved. Because of this, MMDA must cover all modes used in any text or text-like entity, whether it's a photograph, a video, or a written document. Each mode has its own material and historical constraints and opportunities, which we need to describe specifically. At the same time, we also look for shared principles that apply across all modes to understand how they work together. In summary, MMDA helps us analyze how different modes combine to produce meaning, taking into account their unique features and the social context in which they are used. This approach is central to understanding the complex ways in which communication functions in our multimodal world. When we talk about a text, we're referring to the material site where immaterial discourses emerge. Essentially, it's where ideas take shape in a tangible form. Remember, a text is the outcome of semiotic work. It's created through processes like design, composition, and production. In the context of MMDA, or multimodal discourse analysis, a text isn't just written words. It's a multimodal semiotic entity that can be realized across 2, 3, or even 4 dimensions. For example, when students craft a 3D model of a plant cell, they're creating a multimodal text that combines visual, spatial, and sometimes tactile elements. The coherence of such a text depends heavily on how the creator uses semiotic resources. These are the signs, symbols, or cues that help tie everything together. Internally, these resources establish cohesion among the different elements of the text itself. Externally, they connect the text to its environment or context. It's also important to recognize that the reader or interpreter of a text performs semiotic work too. They don't just passively receive information. Instead, they actively interpret and reconstruct the meaning, creating a new, coherent understanding from the original semiotic resources. So, when we think about a multimodal text as a semiotic entity, we see it as a dynamic, layered construct, one that involves both its creation and its interpretation, linking ideas, modalities, and contexts to produce meaning. Social semiotics is a fascinating theory of meaning and communication that helps us understand how we interpret and create meaning across different modes of expression. It focuses on how people use semiotic resources, like images, sounds, gestures, in specific social practices. What's really interesting is that social semiotics highlights shared features that are common across all modes of communication. These include aspects like intensity, framing, foregrounding, coherence, cohesion, and genre. For example, these features might look different depending on the mode. Intensity could be loudness in speech, saturation of color in an image, or bolding in text. The core idea is that these shared characteristics help us understand how meaning is conveyed, regardless of the mode. In multimodal analysis, meaning is seen as explicit, meaning it's clear and transparent, across all modes, even if the vocabulary to describe these meanings is limited. This means that concepts like implicitness or hidden meanings are considered barriers to transparency. So, when we think about the overall potential of meaning in multimodality, social semiotics provides us with a framework to analyze how different modes work together to communicate effectively. It's about understanding not just what is being said or shown, but how the characteristics of each mode contribute to the overall message. Texts reflect the interests of their creators. When we analyze texts, we can actually uncover the motivations and purposes behind them, especially within the institutions where they were produced. Design plays a crucial role here. It's not just about aesthetics, but a key theoretical tool for MMDA. It helps us determine the most appropriate mode of communication, asking, what mode is apt here? Design assumes that the reader has already taken certain actions. Their task is to evaluate the communication environment, considering who the participants are, understanding the power dynamics at play, and recognizing the semiotic requirements of what's being communicated. For example, drawing a joint involves different semiotic considerations than describing it in writing. The reader also has to think about their goals and intentions, what they want to achieve with the message. Essentially, rhetoric becomes a form of politics. It's about navigating and shaping the communication process to serve specific purposes. So, in this context, agency, rhetoric, and design are interconnected. The reader's awareness of their environment and objectives guides how they craft their message, making sure it resonates and functions effectively within the social and institutional landscape. Modes really shape how we encounter the world and how we can remake it into semiotic entities. What I mean is that different modes have their own ways of expressing meaning, and these ways influence how we understand and interact with information. Now, when we talk about the logics of modes, we're referring to the underlying principles that guide them. For example, some modes are based on specific notions of time, like speech or linear writing, which unfold in a sequence. Others are rooted in space, such as visual images or the layout of a page, which organize information spatially. And then there are modes that combine both, like sign language or dance, which incorporate both temporal and spatial logics. Another key point is the material difference between these modes. Writing, for instance, involves lexical and syntactic entities, think words and sentence structures, whereas images rely on depictions and spatial relationships to show connections. These are fundamentally different ways of representing meaning. And this ties directly into how knowledge is shaped. A social agent, whether a person or a community, uses these distinct modes because each offers unique affordances for representation. The choice of mode influences what is known and how it's constructed. So, in essence, modes, their logics, and the way they shape knowledge are deeply interconnected. They don't just change how we communicate, they actively shape what we know and how we understand the world around us. When we talk about making a sign, we're really making knowledge. This means that when we choose a mode of communication, there's always an epistemological commitment involved, whether it's speech, drawing, or any other form. And this commitment isn't something we can avoid. It's built into the very nature of how we represent and interpret information. Now, the interesting part is that this commitment varies depending on the mode we use. For example, if I'm speaking about a cell and I say, "The cell has a nucleus," the factuality here is guaranteed by the use of the universal present tense of has, which indicates possession. This gives us a clear, definite understanding of the relationship. On the other hand, if I show a drawing of the same cell, the relationship shifts. It's now about spatial collocation. The drawing might show the nucleus positioned centrally or at the periphery, and that visual arrangement communicates something different. It's less about factual assertion and more about the spatial relationship or proximity. So these modes contrast along several dimensions. The kind of representation they use, lexis versus depiction, for instance, possession versus proximity or distance, verb form versus spatial arrangement, and even how they handle time, sequence or linearity versus simultaneity or arrangement in appearance. Understanding these differences helps us see how each mode carries its own epistemological commitments, shaping how we interpret what's being communicated. And this ties directly into the broader theme of semiosis, how signs create meaning, and how our understanding is always influenced by the mode we choose to represent information. Let's talk about the concept of information value and design. When we analyze visual texts like signs, we're really looking at the whole ensemble of modes, things like layout, color, writing, images, and font. These elements work together to create specialized knowledge that's specific to a particular site or context. Interpretation involves asking two key questions. First, how was this text designed? Understanding the design choices helps us see what the creators intended. Second, how does this text work for anyone who interacts with it? This means considering how it communicates and influences viewers. The meanings in visual texts are conveyed in two ways. Ideationally, which relates to the ideas or information being presented, and interpersonally, which involves the relationship or tone between the text and its audience. It's also important to recognize the banality of many visual texts, the everyday, unnoticed ways that ideologies and power relations are reproduced through common, mundane practices. Even though these texts might seem ordinary, they still play a role in shaping discourse and social norms. When we analyze static visual texts, we're delving into how these elements work together to produce meaning, often without us immediately realizing it. This process is crucial in understanding how visual communication shapes our perceptions and societal narratives. Let's explore how a complex multimodal text, like a museum exhibition, functions as a rich system of signs that invite visitor interpretation. When visitors engage with these exhibitions, they generate a variety of data, videos, photos, voice recordings, interviews, and maps that help us understand how they make sense of what they see. These different forms of data capture the signs of learning, revealing how visitors interpret and respond to the exhibit. For example, visitor-drawn maps are a fascinating sign. They reflect the visitor's interests, questions, and understanding. These signs serve as a window into their implicit inquiries and the knowledge they construct during their visit. Now, when we analyze these interactions, some critical questions come into play. We're particularly interested in sensory engagement and emotional response. So, does movement within the exhibit catch more attention than lengthy written explanations? And how does lighting influence the mood and feelings that visitors experience? This is where multimodal analysis becomes so valuable. By examining how people interact with the exhibit through different modes, visual, tactile, spatial, we can gain deeper insights into their experience. Ultimately, this approach helps us understand not just what visitors see, but how they feel and interpret the exhibit on a sensory and emotional level. When we look at images in multimodal texts, they rely heavily on what we call figured worlds, which are essentially shared cultural narratives, and they are always part of larger discourses, meaning socially significant identities and activities. This shows us that images aren't just decorative, they're embedded with social and cultural meanings. Now, when we talk about ideology in this context, we're referring to the specific configuration of these discourses that shape a particular text. It's like a lens through which the message is constructed, reflecting certain values or power structures. But to really understand power and meaning in these texts, we need to look beyond just discourse. We have to consider other semiotic categories, things like proximity and distance, that help us grasp how power operates socially and semiotically. For example, how close or distant elements are from each other can influence how we interpret authority, intimacy, or hierarchy within the message. Critical multimodal research is about showing how different semiotic resources, images, words, layout, sounds, are used strategically to serve specific interests, often aligning with particular institutions or ideological positions. And this leads us to the broader shift we see in the field, the multimodal turn in critical discourse analysis. It's a recognition that analyzing texts now requires us to consider multiple modes of communication and how they work together to produce meaning and power. It's an exciting development because it broadens our understanding of how meaning is constructed in complex, multimodal environments. The current era is really marked by rapid changes across social, economic, cultural, political, and technological domains. You can see how fast everything is moving, especially in transportation, which has really accelerated over time. At the same time, new digital, computational, and internet-based technologies are spreading quickly, and these are driving a shift toward more multimodality in how we communicate. What this means is that new media forms now allow us to mix different modes, like text, images, sound, and video, in innovative ways. This blending is actually transforming our traditional understanding of text or conversation, making them more dynamic and multi-layered. Technology, in particular, is pushing us toward a unified semiotics theory. Because now, even non-specialists can select and combine semiotic resources, meaning signs, symbols, and meanings, without needing to be experts. This democratization of semiotics is a huge shift from the past, where such skills were confined to specialists. So, in essence, the role of technology in discourse is profound. It's not just about new tools, but about fundamentally changing how we create, interpret, and share meaning across different modes and platforms. This transformation aligns with the overall theme of how communication is evolving in our digital age. So here we see how the availability of different modes, based on distinct logics like time and space, plays a crucial role in design. In the West, there's a significant shift happening. Linear forms of semiotic organization are being challenged by modular forms. This shift is largely driven by the move from the traditional page, which is a fixed, linear space, to the screen, which offers a more flexible, modular environment. This transformation isn't just about changing the medium. It fundamentally affects how we compose and organize information across all contexts. The page represents linearity. Think of a book or a printed document, where content flows in a sequence. The screen, on the other hand, introduces modularity, allowing for a nonlinear, more adaptable way of structuring content. So the key point here is that this shift from page to screen impacts how we think about and implement design. It pushes us to reconsider the traditional linear approach and embrace modularity, which is more suited to the digital environment. Ultimately, understanding this transition helps us better navigate the evolving landscape of communication and design in our digital age. As we look at this final slide, I want to highlight how the resources available to us today are incredibly diverse and immediately accessible. This means that design and rhetoric have become central to how we communicate and interpret meaning, what we might call essential semiotic dispositions. Rhetoric, in particular, is crucial because every communication is almost always happening in a new context, often with significant differences from what came before. It's this constant need to adapt and persuade that makes rhetorical skills so vital. Now, when we talk about coherence, how well our messages hang together, it becomes more complicated in this environment. The proliferation of screens and the shift toward more horizontal power structures make establishing clear, consistent coherence much more challenging. At the same time, the variety of modes we now have, images, videos, social media, interactive content, actually increases our ability to represent the world in ways that are both apt and compelling. So, in essence, rhetoric, design, and coherence are deeply interconnected. They shape how we frame and understand our world, especially in a landscape that's more dynamic, more diverse, and more visually rich than ever before. This slide really emphasizes that mastering these elements is key to effective communication today.